Welcome to this session on human rights due diligence with a focus on access to remedy. In particular, today we are really looking at how businesses are managing their impact on human rights with the particular lens of human rights due diligence, but with the ultimate aim of really looking at what opportunities does human rights due diligence and changes in this area provide from the perspective of access to remedy. For these purposes, I'd really like to tease out some three key strands of thinking. The first one is the relationship between human rights due diligence and remediation, and in particular, grievance systems. What do grievance systems mean? Whether these are state-based, judicial, non-judicial systems, or non-state-based systems. These provide opportunities for workers to express their rights and to put forward complaints and issues that they have within the ecosystem of work. These are also very much considered to be, this pot of negativity. It's something that nobody feels comfortable talking about. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to disclose what sort of grievances they're seeing, how they're addressing it, etc. It's almost like the poison chalice. So one of the opportunities that has emerged is with this renewed focus through legislation changing, be it through the German due diligence law, the upcoming European CSDD law, the French devoir de vigilance, etc., we now have an opportunity to look at how risks are being identified and how they're being managed. And a key way in which risk is managed and identified, I have to say, is through remediation systems, so grievance systems and other forms of ways in which remedy is accessed. Now, given this opportunity that we have, one of the other observations is very much that in these changes in the law that are coming, including the sanctions-based approaches that we have seen now coming out of the United States through the Customs and Border Protection, and now in the upcoming European law, which very much has a similar focus, preventing goods relating to forced labor, human trafficking, or child labor from entering these various buyer markets. We see that there are principles from the UN guiding principles that are sort of at the origin or genesis of these laws. And therefore, it goes without saying that when thinking about human rights due diligence, when thinking about access to remedy, etc., and all of these related concepts, the centrality and the importance and the highest standard that people should be guided by really are the UN guiding principles. So just something to think about while we reflect through access to remedy. The third point I'd like to make is we are rapidly moving towards a space which is pushing the private sector to move from shareholderism to stakeholderism. This is something that is actively promoted in the UN guiding principles, not just through the centrality of rights holders, but through engagement with affected communities, engagement with various stakeholders. And it's becoming very, very important in these new iterations of the law that the only way in which due diligence can be effectively accomplished and the only way in which remedy can be effectively dispensed is through a broader engagement with stakeholders while maintaining the centrality of rights holders. And finally, there is a wonderful opportunity here for a pairing of corporate leadership and a bottoms-up change in the implementation of the way grievance mechanisms are thought of, designed, and implemented. And what I mean by that is corporate leadership in the space of engagement and really, tending to the rights of affected stakeholders, and at the same time, involving workers and affected stakeholders in the design development of these systems of remediation. Am I painting an ideal picture? Too much of an idealist picture? Maybe a few years ago, one would have said so, but actually we are rapidly moving into a space where this idealism will have to become a reality, particularly with the emergence of such strong regulations and a sanctions-based approach. and with the reputational, financial, and legal risks that accompany these. Now, you'll be delighted to hear this is not a monologue, and I'm joined here by a panel of experts. We're very spoiled today to have joining me in this conversation our three panelists. I'd like to take a moment to introduce each of them. We have Ms. Anna Engblom, who's the Senior Project Coordinator of the Tripartite Action to Enhance the Contribution of Labour Migration to Growth and Development in the ASEAN. And she's with the Triangle 2 project of the ILO and is based in Thailand. We have Jane Raghu joining us from Mauritius, and Jane is the General Secretary of the Confédération des Travailleurs du Secteur Privé, CTSPP. And Jane, I believe you're also a member of Industrial as well. Henriette McCool, who's the Social Innovation and Human Rights Manager at Vinci, and she's joining us from France. Welcome to all of you, and I'm delighted to welcome you to join me in this conversation. So perhaps a good place to start would be with you, Henriette, and to think really, what would you consider to be the key elements of an effective remediation policy or process?
At the risk of stating the obvious, the key elements of an effective remediation system is to be operational and close to the ground. Vinci, like many large companies, we operate in more than 120 countries, and we have close to 260,000 employees. We have a global grievance mechanisms in place, accessible for all direct and indirect employees in many languages that any stakeholder can use to inform and alert the company about business ethics, human rights, health and safety, and the environment. However, this tool is not used very much yet to mitigate issues relating to working and living conditions of workers, or to provide corresponding remedy. So the tools that Vinci have developed and which have started to prove their worth are twofold. We have published a Vinci Guide on Human Rights in 2017, and it's really in an effort to translate the UNGPs, the United Nations Guiding Principles, into operational terms. What does human rights mean for Vinci with regard to our activities? And so we have identified 5 salient risks, which are labor recruitment and migration, working conditions, living conditions, human rights practices in the value chain, and local communities. And there's an annex to help operational people and our staff deploy these guidelines. And to further help the operations deploy these guidelines, we have developed a tool which is called Managing Human Rights, which is a performance tool, a sort of internal audit questionnaire which helps Vinci entities assess themselves and spot potential issues with very concrete recommendations on how to mitigate these issues. And so through these questionnaires, we actively ask questions about workers' recruitment conditions, contracts, working hours, overtime, wages, living wage, local communities, and grievance mechanisms. And while the vast majority of Vinci workers are in very low risks countries, and risks are also very low with our direct workers, what's interesting is that the tool helps operational teams realize that they are expected to make almost the same verifications and due diligence with our supply chain workers, and that this is part of our responsibility. So that tool has now been deployed in 29 countries, in 70 subsidiaries, covering close to 20,000 employees, and that covers more than 70% of employees in high-risk countries. So that's one of the tools that we use. Secondly, the best grievance and remediation system, I think, are local. That's my second element. There needs to be managers, CSR, social staff, looking for feedback from the workers on the ground, communicating about channels of grievances, of dialogue, and that kills the problems at its root without them escalating. And I have in mind an example that I know quite well. It's the grievance mechanism that we implemented in Qatar on Vinci's operations in in Qatar back in 2016, where we actually employed a social worker full-time who was present in the workers' accommodation and following up the issues on a day-to-day basis. And that proved to be extremely efficient because it was operational and it was local. And the human rights approach at Vinci, where we try to be as centered around workers' voice as we can. So we try to include as much as possible in the social and human rights audits that we conduct, interviews of workers, surveys, interviews of direct, temporary workers, subcontractors workers, and to push for social dialogue, even in countries where trade unions are not necessarily valued or allowed.
Thank you, Henriette. And I pick up some key elements here. One is the creation of knowledge and expertise internally. Second is operationalizing and teaching people how to really implement and practice that knowledge that you're giving them from the UN guiding principles. The cascading down into the supply chains, into these pockets of vulnerability. And of course, the identification of your salient risks, which is, such an important part of the process. And I liked in particular what you said about the local systems being best. And I think one point that really speaks to me is the social worker staying with the workers, because often I feel that there is a disconnect between workers and systems that are built for their use, because there isn't that connectivity. And it seems that, you've got that through the social worker engagement, etc. So it's really good to hear that. And I'd like to turn to you to continue along this theme. Why is worker engagement important when it comes to addressing, in particular, recruitment-related human rights abuses? We all know that, the journey of exploitation doesn't start in the country of destination. It starts much earlier in a village somewhere where somebody meets someone who tells them about a job, and then, the chain is long after that.
Thank you, Shana, for the great introduction to these important issues. It's great to be here on behalf of the ILO on this panel. So the first point I'd like to make is that despite the fact that there has been a lot of international attention to issues of abuses of migrant workers during the recruitment process, we know, and as you have already highlighted, Shana, we know that research after research shows that migrant workers continue to be subject to exploitation and abuse. And I'd just like to go quickly over what we see in the work that we do in Southeast Asia as the main forms of exploitation and abuse. First of all, it's the issue of overcharging of recruitment fees. And there is a global consensus that recruitment costs and fees should not be paid by migrant workers. And this is established in several international frameworks in the ILO Private Employment Agency Convention and the ILO 2018 General Principles and Operational Guidelines of Fair Recruitment provides a definition on what fees and costs that workers should not pay as part of their employment, as part of their recruitment. But still, we know that workers continue to pay too much. We also see deception and contract substitution, and this is basically when the recruitment agency knowingly provides wrong information about working employment conditions or change the terms of employment to which the worker originally agreed. Retention of passport or travel documents has been addressed today in a lot of national legal framework, but it's still a problem. I think the biggest problem is during employment is non-paid payment and deduction of wages or wage theft, as many call it. From the ILO, we recognize a fundamental role of access to justice in protecting all workers, including migrant workers, at all stages of the migration cycle. And this right to effective grievance is find that right protected in a number of the conventions, the forced labor conventions, the ILO migration conventions, domestic worker convention, violence and harassment conventions, etc. And the important principle here is that Migrant workers, they need to enjoy access to justice free from discrimination, meaning there needs to be no discrimination based on race, nationality, religion, sex, etc. And that right is also confirmed in a number of international conventions. So despite this, we see that migrant workers suffer a number of barriers to access grievance mechanisms. This includes legal barriers, meaning that the migrant workers are not properly reflected under relevant national laws or regulations. It can be because they work in the private sector, which is excluded from protection, like agriculture or domestic workers often are. There are also issues related to accessibility, like language barriers, migrant workers not being able to pay legal fees. They don't understand the country's legal framework. They don't have time to follow outcome of their cases, for example. So from the ILO side, we recognize that these are important challenges for the workers who are at the center, of course, in these cases. So we have responded to some of these challenges by supporting what we call migrant worker resource centers. My project runs 24 such centers in Southeast Asia in partnership with governments, trade unions, or CSOs. And an important part of these centers is to provide legal services to migrant workers. And today, and this is just to illustrate how important these services are, we have over a period of around 8 years been able to secure $10.9 million in compensation for legal complaints to migrant workers. So that kind of shows that it's just a drip in the ocean, but it shows the big need and demand for these types of services.
Absolutely, Anna, and I really second that, because actually in the work that we do in the region, it is very clear that for many migrant workers, going to a migrant resource center, such as the one you were just describing, is actually the only place they know where to go. And it's primarily by word of mouth. And, it was very interesting in the work that we've been doing when we are engaging with migrant workers. A comment that comes back over and over again is, if only I knew where to go, and if only I knew who to talk to and what to do. And, this is very interesting, because now it's emerging that in this ecosystem of remedy, there are various actors who are playing different roles and providing different access into the world of remedy. But it's not always clear to workers, because these systems are not well socialized with them, and they don't necessarily have access to the entry points. And the systems that are state-based come with their own issues. Very often they're, as you say, out of reach for migrant workers. One of the very important actors in this ecosystem are trade unions. Unfortunately, while the codes of conduct of most multinationals say that everybody should have the freedom to associate, everybody should have the freedom to join a trade union, the reality on the ground is very different. In many countries, migrant workers are not allowed to engage with trade unions or form their own trade unions, or they're not allowed to be part of the leadership of trade unions. Now, it remains the fact that trade unions provide a very important entry and access into the world of remedy. So Jane, how can engagement with trade unions improve the effectiveness of a company's human rights and policies?
Thank you, Archana. Hi, everybody. So yes, to begin with, I'd like to comment on your introduction while you were explaining on a beautiful, in French we say tableau, that you think that maybe you are dreaming that we can have a better, representation so that workers' rights are really upheld. So one word came to my mind is justice. So what we are dealing with right now is that we want justice for migrant workers, okay? And this can be done through social dialogue, I sincerely believe that social dialogue is a very important component. And while many companies, be it in Mauritius or elsewhere, while we adhere to all the ILO conventions and particularly on the one on social dialogue, but we came to realize, but in practice, that what we call social dialogue is not really present. But I'll tell you how in Mauritius, we are a small island with only 1.2 million inhabitants, and you know what is happening right now is that more and more migrant workers are coming to Mauritius from Madagascar, from Bangladesh, from India, from recently from Sri Lanka, but now it has stopped. But the issues that are reported to our center, to our, first of all, to our trade union, we are a confederation of trade unions, is the same. It's a violation of rights, what workers have signed in their country of origin, and as per the contract of employment. But when they come to Mauritius and then they discover that what they have signed over there is totally untrue, because here they thought that they will get so many in terms of wages, but when they come here, they are told that, yes, you can get that kind of amount, but you have to do huge amount of overtime. And this is having a direct impact on their health and safety. So we do represent workers in the garment sector, in the construction sector, and our biggest problem lies with multinational and Chinese multinationals specifically in the construction sector. We are also, as you rightly pointed out at the beginning, you said that we are a member of the Industrial Global Union, but we are also a member of the BWI, Building Woodworkers International, and I know that Vinci signed an agreement with that, which is very interesting. And everybody is trying their level best, to protect workers, but we need something more. And while I'm talking to you right now, there's a team of the CTSP that are actually in a company, in the biggest textile company in Mauritius, who always refused our access to work site, who always refused. But with the intervention of a brand, which is ASUS, who everybody about ASUS, right? So ASUS intervene, and then we gain access to the factory. And right now, I have a pool of 5 young workers from the CTSP who are there, and they are giving a training on an application, an app, which is called the Just Good Work Mauritius. You can look it out on the web. It's called Just Good Work Mauritius. And what is interesting is what you're saying is how really companies can improve, trade unions can improve the effectiveness of companies. Is first, we had that social dialogue, right? But we didn't have it on our own. We could not, because employers, they have a tendency to say, trade unions, these are people that are coming to bring, to create havoc in our company. We don't want them here. But when they understand that, when workers know their rights really, and then when they know that kind of rights, they will go through a good process, through a good mechanism, so that they can bring about their issues with the help of the trade unions, and then everything will be going on smoothly. Right now in Mauritius, when we have issues reported by migrant workers, most, except for the company that we are having a training today on the app, most of the companies, they are forced to come before the Ministry of Labor to resolve those issues, while it could have been done another way if there were true social dialogue. You see, why employers, because they through the labor legislation, here we have the Employment Relations Act, they have to abide to that kind of legislation, then they are forced to come to the ministry whenever a dispute is reported. While they could have come easily, we could have contacted them right directly to have the issues resolved, but we cannot. And I think that what you are saying is that we need a kind of platform so that we can have, we need to create a system that works for all parties, and then we can engage in that social dialogue that I'm putting much emphasis on, so that we can have proper dispute resolution mechanism so that workers' rights are upheld. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. You summed up the ecosystem of remediation so beautifully. You indeed painted a beautiful tableau, as you said earlier. Social dialogue, such a critical, component, the glue almost that holds all of the different stakeholders together in that platform that you just mentioned. I really liked in particular the practical example you gave of ASOS's engagement. And in particular, it's an example of the use of commercial leverage, which can bring people to the table who originally would be off the table. So it allowed you to get access to premises that you really needed to get access to of a supplier. And that's so important. And it's such an important segue and a very good segue for you, Henriette. And I'd really like to hear from you a little bit. How should businesses engage with the broader stakeholder ecosystem? So the workers, suppliers, trade unions, civil society. These are sometimes very problematic relationships for business, particularly as there is a lack of trust, there is not great communication. We come, from a space of the naming and shaming of companies. What can you do better in order to engage with these stakeholders?
I'm not saying VINCI is perfect, but we are a strong believer in collaboration with stakeholders. We consult yearly with VINCI trade union and employee representative, both at French and European level, on our duty of vigilance plan. So that's the first thing. And VINCI is sharing quite regularly with worker representation bodies its due diligence efforts. So I'm thinking of the FETBB, it's the French Building and Construction Workers Confederation. On a more general note, we know that human rights issues are complex and that we cannot solve them on our own. One good example is the issue of corruption and illegal recruitment fees in the countries of origin when we recruit migrant workers. Again, migrant workers is very specific to some of our regions of operation. This is not the majority of VINCI's employee, but I'm talking here about the Middle East, where our operations are much smaller now, but where we have had operations. It's difficult to pretend that a French company operating in Qatar can solve corruption issues in India or Bangladesh or Nepal. We have been able to do it to solve issues of recruitment fees with our direct workers. So perhaps it's possible also and this is what we did with the ILO, it's possible with a couple of subcontractors, with a lot of work and involvement. But eventually we need to work with trade unions, with governments, with civil society to have a kind of leverage on this issue. And if VINCI moves to another country, we have to start everything from scratch again. So the ecosystem is needed. And obviously it's not just one company which can solve issues which are as big as recruitment fees and issues of forced labor. So perhaps I will give examples of two very important collaborations that we've had with stakeholders at VINCI. The first one is the partnership, the workers' rights agreement that VINCI has signed with BWI, Building and Woodworkers International, in Qatar. It's very important for companies to have third-party assessments of their operations, especially in the context of the World Cup, where Qatar is under the spotlight for the way migrant workers are treated. And we, as a construction company in Qatar, we are almost inaudible when we try to explain that despite a challenging context, a company can implement strong due diligence measures and provide safe and decent conditions, including for its temporary and supply chain workers. So it was really important for us to have the advice, the regular visits, the regular audits of BWI. We have had up to 4. We started it in 2015 with the first one, and the last one was last year, and we published these reports publicly. It's important for us to be transparent about what they find, about their recommendations. It's important to have this third-party observation. And the second very important stakeholder that Vinci works with is the ILO in Qatar. Once again, working with the ILO has really been instrumental in human rights due diligence and remediation efforts. Vinci had already done a lot of work on fair recruitment with its direct workers, but thanks to our partnership, a public-private partnership with the ILO office in Qatar, we managed to tackle our supply chain. And the fact that the ILO was behind meant that our major manpower provider stayed for the duration of the project during 3 years. It meant that there was a dialogue with the Ministry of Labor in Qatar, and it created this ecosystem of trust where we knew that they were not here to name and shame, but to sort of have access to how recruitment works in the construction sector, and also to help us transmit the good practices into our supply chain. So very concrete results. That partnership led to leading 93% of workers not to pay any fees. And for those who still paid, the amounts were reduced from more than $3,000 from workers of Bangladesh to only $300. And the fact that we had put a local grievance mechanism in place meant that the issues could be spotted, and for those who paid, the majority of them managed to be obtain some reimbursement, and we organized this reimbursement. What's really important as well when we work with stakeholders is the fact that it gives more leverage, but it also leads to more legacy. After the pilot, STS, the Vinci's major manpower provider in Qatar, has continued to recruit fairly, both in its construction and its hospitality branch. And so that represents more than 2,000 workers now. And so working with stakeholders is key, because we know that this equilibrium can be fragile. We know that if only Vinci does it, there will be no legacy, and therefore it's not really in the culture of the construction sector, but it's really something that we tend to work more and more with stakeholders.
You raised so many important points here. I mean, one is the need for a multi-layered approach to remedy. So the global is not enough. We need a local system as well. And in the local system, there need to be different entry points that you can access through partnerships with different parties. Credibility is so important. And very often partners like the ILO bring a dimension of credibility and independence that is very necessary. And what I really like in your contribution as well is this notion of legacy and the importance of sustainability, because the world of work will always be full of issues, and we need systems that will outlast a particular spate of issues that are happening now, and that create systems, processes, protocols, and engagement, the platform for social dialogue that will continue to last over time. And that's so important. So, Anna, if I can turn to you, and Henriette set the scene really well for the ILO and what the ILO does. Could you perhaps speak a little bit more about how the ILO can really help build a bit of complementarity between these partners who are often quite disparate and in diverse areas, even though they're part of the same ecosystem?
Yeah, thank you. It was really great to hear, Henriette, your experiences and how you, together with the ILO, have been able to reduce recruitment fees for workers, etc. I think we are often. It's not that often that we have an opportunity to work with individual companies. I mean, we work a lot with employer associations and workers associations, but not with individual employers. So I think this was really super interesting to hear about your experiences. I just like to say perhaps that ILO is the only UN agency that has a tripartite structure. And that means that everything we do in dialogue, in cooperation between governments, employers, and workers, in everything that has to do with labor, including formulation and implementation of standards and policies. So I think we are a very good example of an agency that kind of fits right into what we are discussing right now. And I think in terms of maybe let me take a little bit more an academic approach, perhaps on how businesses should engage from my point of view with the broader stakeholders. So first, I think it's very important that businesses know who the key stakeholders really are. And I mean, it might sound straightforward initially, but I mean, there are a lot of stakeholders or affected groups that we might not initially see, that do not have a lot of voice or visibility in public forums. I think it's the first starting point really to look at, to do a proper stakeholder mapping and see who are the stakeholders, who are the affected groups, who are those that we need to hold in dialogue and action. And secondly, when we know who they are, we need to be clear over how we can best engage with them. And I think, I mean, my work has shown that there is no, one size fits all approach when it comes to engagement. I mean, different stakeholders, different affected groups have different barriers. There are language barriers, there are cultural barriers, there are gender barriers. There are important power imbalances that we need to see there. And communication is, of course, very important here, as well as identifying the right forum for how we engage with the different groups. Not everyone is comfortable to speak up in big public forums or discussions. But certain groups might require smaller and more private spaces to choose to engage, to want to engage, to voice their concerns and issues that they have. Um, Trade unions, for example, I mean, we work a lot with trade unions, but there are strong trade unions, strong CSOs, strong recruitment agency associations who are very vocal and very powerful. But there are other migrant groups that has less voice, and they might not come forward when you have these other powerful actors. So we need to find a balance how we can work with all of them. And I think it's also important to find ways to engage that don't put stakeholders or affected stakeholders, perhaps the affected groups, at risk through our engagement. We know that migrant workers, including undocumented workers, are key. We need to consult with them, but they often choose not to come forward because when they voice their concerns, when they raise their voices, there is a risk that they will lose the jobs. If they lose the jobs, they will lose their contract status. They will also lose their registration status, so they might have to be deported and might have to lose the legal status to stay in the country. So we have to be careful when and how we engage. And I think maybe just to add, I think the last point is that it's better to engage as early as possible. Let's not wait with stakeholders engagement until a decision is about to be made or there is a problem. We need to consult and build trust around and between relations as early on as possible.
I think you mentioned something very important there, which was around the engagement of migrant workers in particular, and of workers themselves, and of their being able to have a seat at the table and to be able to contribute to the discourse and to all this conversation that affects them. However, this is not a reality for many, and the fact that people still are experiencing reprisals against them, people risk getting terminated. There are union busting, activities that are very common. How then, Jane, if I can ask you, should businesses engage with workers, with trade unions, in order to maximize access to remedy?
Yes, what I was saying is that from the example that Ariel just said, the engagement that Vinci with other trade union and with specifically BWI did, there is hope. There is hope for other companies, I think, because it depends on, I tend to focus on what I just said on social dialogue. What has happened for Vinci and BWI? It is social dialogue. Henriette rightly pointed out that not everything is, I mean, in French we say en rose, but still they are progressing, you see. So, but in Mauritius, unfortunately, it's not the case, because in Mauritius, now with free education, even at tertiary level, our citizens doesn't want to do some kind of work. I mean, to work in construction sector, in government sector, in the seafood sector. And if they go in that kind of sectors, they will prefer to do white collar job and not blue or brown collar job. So definitely we need to have migrant workers, right? But even in the catering sector now, in hotels, the employers are crying, saying we need to have migrant workers, and more people are coming. During the, if I may add on that, during the COVID period, while we have been to a standstill for almost 2 years, that's when, for 2020 and 2021, that's when we really came across all the problems that migrant workers were facing. To begin with, they didn't have the hygienic facilities in their dormitories. The dormitories were not cleaned. They didn't have enough food. Wages were not paid. And, when the workers, they tend to be quite docile, not protesting and so on. But at a point in time when they can't bear the conditions anymore, and unfortunately it will burst. And that's how they come to us through the police station. How do they know about us? It's through the police station. They go to the police station to report, but at the police station, you don't have a mechanism to bring the employer to task. So the police will refer them to the trade union, to us, because they know that we cater for migrant workers. And like that, we have been able to really understand that, in fact, the issues were very direct and to the point, and it required only that the employer could abide to the law and to have a proper dispute resolution mechanism that didn't exist. And then that's how we created the Migrant Resource Center at our center itself, the MRC, where what we do is that we provide accurate information and advice to workers. We facilitate access to remedy, who report grievances against their employers. We provide, this is very important, we provide a safe space for migrant workers to interact freely and openly with each other. That what they can't do even in their dormitory, because in their dormitory, we say, like every worker, even local or migrant workers, when you are in a group, at some point in time, there will be whistleblowers who are with the management, who will say, this one is complaining and so on. And then you will see that the employer will sack them, will just cancel their work permit, and they will be sent back to their country of origin. So we have a difficulty here in Mauritius that even we had to go to the National Human Rights Commission in Mauritius to report all kind of abuses. And we have even got a report on what is to be done. But, things tend to be very slow. Our voices on the trade union part can be heard only if we go on the street, if we protest. That's when our voices are heard. Or if we go to press conferences, we go on Facebook and so on. And we have even started to do TikTok, because this reach to workers quite easily. But definitely we have a language problem. We don't have so many issues with Malagasy workers because they understand French, and it's easy for them to have recourse to and they go to the Catholic Church in Mauritius to have try to get remedy. But even then the Catholic Church send them to us. And then the Indian workers, in Mauritius, most people speak Hindi as well. So it's easy for them to to have access to the dispute resolved. But for Bangladeshi workers, it's quite a different history. You see, it's very difficult. And that's why sometimes you will hear more protests coming from Bangladeshi workers. And the employers, and they don't really listen. They need to be brought to the Ministry of Labour. And we need, I think that with the UN guiding principle, if companies are supposed to abide to all these, definitely our local laws also need to be changed so that, you know, employers tend to abide to laws. But if the law itself does not protect the workers, the employer will have a tendency to say, but I'm respecting the law, even if the law is not, you know, protecting the workers. That's how the situation here emerges. But what we have done is that we have collaborated with Anti-Slavery International, with ASUS, and we have produced the app that I was telling you. We have two hotlines, and we have people speaking Hindi on those hotline and French also for the Malagasy. And then we have the MRC, of course. And then we have a training session because we have recruited many youth and they know, and we have a policy to say, here, when people come and report their issues, you have to take it from A to Z. So you have to take the complaint and you have to have it done, and the worker issues is resolved to his satisfaction. We try our level best, but we are not. We don't say that everything is on. Yeah. You see, that's
understand, and you know, I mean, the complexity of the issues that we are talking about mean that resolution is rarely easy. It takes many leverage points, it takes many conversations, it takes many approaches, reflected in how you have hotlines, you have an MRC, you have, you know, access through a multitude of languages, you now have an app, etc. What I also really like is that the MRC provides a safe space for workers to interact with each other. I think one of two things we found in recent research we conducted with workers over 4 different countries in Southeast Asia was one that when they have a problem, they prefer to go to their peers first, because they prefer to speak to people who are in a similar situation so that they trust them and they would take advice from them. So Facebook Messenger groups become like a really, you know, a very buzzy place. And where people can physically interact with each other, that becomes a big source of comfort and support as well. And I think the other thing is, you talked about how the employers have to be brought to the labor ministry in order to have that conversation and to listen. There are 2 points in this. One is the issue of lack of corporate accountability, lack of often laws or lack of enforcement of laws to hold employers accountable. That's one. You need to have a stick. There can't just be carrots everywhere and no sticks. You need to have a stick. There needs to be that safety net of the law, of state taking the right measures to respect, protect, and remedy vulnerable people, period. And the second thing that you know I really like is the fact that in our research, we also heard from workers how they prefer to resolve issues on a consensus-based approach. They don't want to go down the court route first. They would rather resolve things to the extent that they can by dialogue. And therefore, it's really important that when we are designing grievance systems, that we are able to give the space and the platform for this dialogue to happen in a safe and non-retaliatory and confidential manner. So, you know, I guess, you know, what I want to hear from you all, perhaps my final question to each one of you, and Henriette, maybe I can go back to you for this one. You work in the private sector, and I would like to hear from you. What would you like to see change in the way businesses manage their impact on human rights?
The one change I'd like to see is more resources, both human and financial. This is for me the key issue. just like health and safety officers were considered a luxury a couple of decades ago, a resource only affordable for oil and gas companies, it's now unthinkable for construction companies not to have an HSE, health and safety policy, management system, risk assessments, and it needs to be the same with human rights, with ESG, with social issues. Human rights should not be dealt at headquarters only or for reporting purposes only. I'm coming back to the fact that we need a lot more human rights teams on the ground at operational level, especially in countries where workers are most at risk, where they're known to be at risk. Perhaps one word about an important stakeholder that we haven't spoken about for the private sector, and those are the investment communities and our investors. They are increasingly including human rights issues in their question. They are starting to conduct due diligence on human rights issues, forced labor, the living wage, workers' rights in our supply chain. And I recently participated in an investors roundtable. And it was interesting to hear them say that they had similar issues as us. They basically have a few ESG or human rights experts, but the main people in charge of the large portfolios are not yet trained on ESG and human rights issues. So it would really be great to see human rights on top of the agenda, systematically paired with environmental issues. I know that there are a lot of pressing issues that they are competing with each other, that we can't put all of them on top of the pile. But I mean, we've sent people on the moon in 1969. In 1969, I don't see why in 2022 we can't solve the issue of forced labor. It's not rocket science. We know more or less the solutions. Yes, the issues are complex, but I really think that it's a question of mindset, of setting our priorities right, and of putting resources into it. Resources is the key thing for me.
I completely hear you. And, you know, the number of times we are approached by private sector actors who are seeking expertise or experience around, you know, looking at risk, assessing and managing risks. And then they'll tell you, can you do it for this really shoestring budget, because we don't have a budget to this. This is the human rights should be a boardroom conversation in every company. And there needs to be a very clear budget allocation and resources allocation to deal with this issue, just as you would with looking at, you know, future investments, etc. Very interesting what you say about the investment community, because now banks are increasingly saying to companies that if you have a good ESG scorecard, you have good social performance, environmental and governance indicators, we can consider giving you a preferential rate for your working capital, etc. So really all of these things, you know, are happening slowly but surely. But I do agree with you. Human rights teams on the ground sounds like a really sensible way forward, as well as the investment into this space. Anna, could I ask you the same question?
Right, thank you. I'll keep it short. I have four recommendations. First, I think honest engagement and involvement with all affected groups and stakeholders is absolutely important to ensure understanding and respect for human rights among the business community. And we need to make sure that these processes are done in such a way that they help businesses to understand what the real issues are that the affected groups face, that they learn from these experiences, and that this conduct is improved accordingly. And if businesses don't already have, they should establish corporate grievance mechanisms. These are important complement to other state-based and non-state-based judicial mechanisms that are in place. And we need to make sure that they are designed in such a way that workers feel safe when they are using them. There are good examples out there. We can study them, we can learn. ILO, others can come in and help business community in setting these up and looking at the best way given the different environments that they are working in. And finally, I think let's be ambitious and set the bar high. Try to adjust your business conduct with the international standard and global guidance, not with the view to comply with national laws. We know that national laws is often set at a minimum level. Let's try to go beyond that.
Absolutely. And it really is about working to a higher standard. And as I mentioned during the opening, the UN guiding principles is the higher standard. And that's really what we should really be working towards. And in building these corporate grievance mechanisms, we must always remember who they're being built for, and they must be consulted in the design, creation, and implementation of these mechanisms. Jane, can I ask you the same question?
So, yes, thank you, Archana. What I believe that employers should not see us, trade union, as adversary. But it will not happen now, or if we don't take action for it to happen. And I think that the ILO has a great part to play in that. And I must say, the ILO has already started with the SAM project, which is currently in practice for the moment. I think it's a two years project. And through the SAM project, what is happening? The ILO meet the trade union separately from employers concerned in the different sectors, and then bring us together. And this facilitates the dialogue. And through this, so many beautiful things are happening. For example, before we could not talk to the MEXA. The MEXA is the Export Processing Zone Association in Mauritius. But through that project, the MEXA now has asked our expertise. They want us on board. They want us to share experiences, what is happening in the case of migrant workers, and how we can together resolve those issues. But this needs to happen at every level. So that I believe that since the ILO is a tripartite body, they have the expertise, they have the capacity, they have everything that could help all parties concerned, put us together, meet with us like the SAM project separately, so that we know when we come together, we don't just, bring our fist on the table and the employers don't want to talk to us trade unions. We need to respect each other. We need to build that trust, that confidence, but we need that social dialogue to be able to, render justice to migrant workers, because they are human beings just like us. We need everybody. Even Archana, you are from Mauritius, but you are working in another country. You see, we are all some way, somehow, as expat in other, migrant expat in other countries. But we all need that kind of protection. We need to be really protected, and we need to live happily. And for any business, we need labor and we need capital. Okay, the big business, they have the capital, and we have the labor. So why can't both parties be happy? Because if every party is happy, that's how the profit will come up, and then there will be sharing, you see? So I'm not dreaming like you started, Archana. I believe that as human beings, and I'm very happy to see that it's a platform that mostly women are on that platform, because they say that women will change the world. So I'm very positive there, and I think that together we can change the mindset of men and bring them together on the table, and then we can change the world and make it a better place for everybody to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. On that women power note, I will totally abuse of my prerogative of being a moderator, and I will close today's session by asking myself the same question. And my answer would very much be that I would like to see businesses engage with workers in different ways. And perhaps grievance systems could be a very positive way in which employers could engage employees by providing this as a platform for dialogue and engagement, where workers can engage with grievance systems to express their rights and to seek enforcement of their rights. and where companies can use that as a means of identifying their risk and managing their risk effectively. You very rightfully say that if everybody is happy, the profits go up. The reality is that although it seems that we are all coming at it from diverse perspectives and we all have different agendas, in the end, we are all pushing in the same direction. The worker left his home and his country and his family and community to seek prosperity and economic prosperity for his people. The company is seeking to do the same for its shareholders. Within that, there are so many commonalities. Labor shortages are a reality of the world that we live in. This is not about to change. It is also a fact that international standards are often very far from the local realities on the ground. But there is a role for each and every stakeholder to play in this ecosystem, so that access to remedy and access to justice is not a luxury for migrant workers. I sincerely hope that in the future, when we have this conversation, it will be possible for migrant workers to sit here and to share with us. And that is something that I continue to hope for. And I do feel that we do have a window of opportunity for change, which is being brought by regulatory changes, which is being brought by some fantastic like-minded people, such as our panelists today. And we must push this window of opportunity open and take advantage as much as we can, because for many workers, today is already too late. So there is an urgency to act. And I'm really certainly very optimistic about where we go from here. Thank you very much. And thank you to our wonderful panelists for this such a rich conversation. Thank you.